Okay, so today we are going to try to make fetch happen. We're going to start with talking about asynchronous JavaScript. So let's say we're getting ready for the day and we're going to stop at Starbucks on the way. When we think of things happening synchronously, you go through the drive-through window and each car is going to get its coffee in order. Even if that means that we have to wait extra long because the car in front of you ordered pastries for their little office. Asynchronous is when we go inside and the person in front of you orders a Trenta soy caramel latte extra hot, and then you order a tall pike. You will get your coffee first because it was quicker to make. So right now we're here in the browser and let's look at some code. We have this code here with 3 console log statements. In what order are we going to expect these console logs to print? Let's copy and paste this, and we're going to put it in our browser and we're going to see. Oops, not that, down there. And we see here that I am first, I am second, I am last. We know that console logs are pretty quick, but what if the second one, the I am second, was a function that made some kind of network request that was going to take like a second or two? What if it was hitting some external API? The third console log would not run until the previous line of code was executed. And this kind of presents a problem on the front end. So let's take a look at some different code. Let's look at this. Let's take a moment, pause the video if you want, and kind of work through this code in your head, and try to determine in what order things will print. And let us copy and paste this into our console. And we hit enter. And we saw a little pause. We had the legend, wait for it, a little pause in dairy. And the reason why that happened in that sequence. So I guess let's take a step back. We expect that we have the legend part. We have this timeout of 2000, I presume that's milliseconds. We wait for 2000 milliseconds, 2 seconds, dairy, and then open out wait for it. So the thing is, set timeout is actually an asynchronous function, which executes its callback after waiting for a lot of time to expire. We're going to talk more about how that works under the hood in Mod 4, but for now, let's just say that it runs like on its own. So we have fetch. You might have used Ajax in the past, which is a part of jQuery. It has its benefits and is definitely still used, but another great tool that we have to make network requests is the fetch API, which we'll be implementing today. From the documentation, the fetch method takes one mandatory argument, the path to the resource we want to fetch. It returns a promise that resolves to the response to the request, whether it's successful or not. So for an example of that, let's go to my notes. We have this here. We have the fetch method function, and it takes this one argument, this URL, and this is just I'm just going to open up a new tab and post this in. And we see that it just gives us this kind of just some trivia, open trivia. OpenTDB? What is OpenTDB? I believe that is an open trivia database, which is kind of cool. Yeah, cool. So it has an API that we can access questions and answers, and it doesn't really matter, but we know that we can fetch that. And so we see that fetch. So let me hit enter here. Promise pending. We see that fetch returns a promise that resolves to the response of our request. We haven't talked about promises yet, but what you need to know is that we can call .then callback, which will then execute our callback as soon as the response comes in. So in other words, we wait until we have all the data or an error back, and then it will execute whatever we say to do next with the data. So we can take this here, this bit of code, and what we can see here is that we're running fetch with the URL to this to this API, and then we have a dot then at the end, and inside these parens are the callback, and like I said, the callback is what's going to do, and what it's going to do is that as soon as it receives that information, it's going to execute whatever is inside these parens. In that case, it's going to print this out to the screen. And we see here that it's pending, and then the response is redirected false, true. Excellent. Cool. We get some stuff in here, and we got all this extra information. Da, da, da. Cool. So we got that response. And so if then is like waiting in line like a car at the drive-thru Starbucks, what is this? What about this is asynchronous? So the thing is that fetch is asynchronous. Other functions can run in the background while we're making this entire request. It's necessary that the then blocks, the then, what goes in the parentheses, behave synchronously, and they wait on the resolution of the previous promise in order to do their jobs. So if you plug the code into the browser in the console above, we see the response object comes back. But the problem here is that we can't get the data we want back from the response body. We saw that. That's like all this extra stuff. But there's one more step. We have to parse the response. And we're going to use the body.json method with the that comes with fetch to parse it and then call that. So from the docs, the .json method returns a promise that resolves the result of parsing the body text as JSON. So anything that's represented by the JSON object, an array, string, number, it'll kind of parse that and deal with it for us. So it'll give us access to the response. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to my notes, and we're going to grab this here. Paste that in. And when we hit enter, we see here that we get back this object. What is the gray wolf scientific name? Canis lupus. And we saw we got that this here is something more akin to data we can use rather than what we got before. Fantastic. And finally, we can also add in a catch that will take into account any kind of errors we get. And that looks a little something like this, right? So we're running a fetch on this API. We're going to get back, and we're going to run the .json function on it, which is going to give us a parse function. And then we're going to print that to the screen, and in case there are any errors, we are going to run a catch. So this is pretty quick. Like, maybe this API responds pretty quickly, so it's not something that we're going to have, we're going to get to really see this kind of the kind of advantage of asynchronous operations, but we get the idea. And so we lead into our talk about promises. A promise is an object representing the eventual completion or failure of an asynchronous operation. So in our case, we can think of a promise as a placeholder that will do something once it receives a response back from the server. And the great thing about promises is that since they're just objects, we can move them around like an object and return them from functions. Cool. So practice for you is going to be clone down the repo of the fetch introduction and kind of work through that. And that's been an introduction on how to make fetch work.